The sky was already burning. Missiles streaked across the darkness, invisible to most of the world, but not to the people living beneath them. Sirens cut through the night. Oil prices surged by the hour. Governments scrambled behind closed doors. And then, another escalation. A message delivered not from a battlefield, but from a screen. A threat so extreme it could reshape the war overnight. The destruction of power, water, energy, the systems that keep millions alive. If no deal is reached, they would all be wiped out. And in that moment, the conflict changed. Because this was no longer just about war. It was about how far one side was willing to go to end it. By the time that message was sent, the war had already begun. For weeks, the region had been sliding toward something larger, not in a single moment, but in fragments, missile strikes, retaliation, statements that sounded like warnings, but felt like preparation. Iran had not backed down. Wave after wave of missiles had been launched toward Israel, each one carrying more than just explosives. They carried a signal that Tehran was willing to absorb pressure and respond in kind. And Israel, backed by the United States, continued its campaign. Airstrikes, strategic targets, a slow tightening of pressure that suggested this wasn't meant to end quickly. This was not diplomacy failing. This was escalation unfolding. At sea, the stakes were even higher. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping lanes on Earth, was under threat. A narrow corridor through which a significant portion of the world's oil flows every single day. If that passage closes, even briefly, the consequences don't stay in the Middle East. They ripple outward. Fuel prices surge, supply chains strain, entire economies begin to feel the pressure, and already the signs were there. Oil markets reacted almost instantly, prices climbing at a pace not seen in decades. Traders weren't just watching the conflict, they were pricing in fear. The possibility that this war wouldn't stay contained. Behind the scenes, diplomats moved quickly. Meetings, proposals, back-channel negotiations involving multiple countries: Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. An effort to contain something that was already slipping beyond control. But there was a problem. There were no direct talks, no clear line between Washington and Tehran. Only messages passed through intermediaries, each one interpreted, reshaped, and often rejected. Iran called the proposals unrealistic, excessive, detached from reality. And at the same time, voices inside the country were becoming more defiant. Not cautious, not restrained, defiant. Warnings of retaliation, promises of punishment, even suggestions that if American troops entered the region, they would be met with force immediately. This wasn't the language of negotiation. It was the language of a country preparing for something bigger. And yet, on the other side, there was still talk of a deal, still talk of peace coming soon. But if that was true, why were the threats becoming more extreme? Why was the rhetoric shifting from pressure to destruction? Because something had changed, and whatever it was pushing both sides closer to a line that, once crossed, would be impossible to walk back. It didn't come from a press conference. There were no flags, no podium, no formal declaration of policy. Just a post, a few sentences, dropped into the middle of an already unstable war. But the words carried weight far beyond their format. If a deal was not reached soon, the United States would target Iran's most critical systems, not just military bases, not just missile sites, everything: power stations, oil infrastructure, and even desalination plants, the facilities that turn seawater into drinkable water for millions. In a region where water is survival. That wasn't just a military threat, it was existential. Because these are not targets you strike lightly. Electric grids don't just power cities, they sustain hospitals, communications, transportation. Without them, modern life collapses in hours. Water systems are even more fragile. Remove them, and entire populations are pushed toward crisis within days. And oil? That's not just fuel. It's the backbone of Iran's economy, the artery that connects the country to the global market. Disrupt it, And the effects don't stay contained inside Iran's borders, they spread outward, fast. So when those three targets were named together, it sent a clear message. This wasn't about precision, it was about pressure at the highest possible level, or something else entirely. Because under international law, those kinds of strikes raise immediate questions. Civilian infrastructure, especially water and energy systems, is protected in most circumstances. Even in war, there are limits, lines that are not supposed to be crossed. And if they are, it doesn't just escalate the conflict, it changes its nature. Human rights organizations were quick to respond. They warned that targeting such systems could be unlawful, that the scale of civilian harm would likely be disproportionate, that it could cross into something far more serious than conventional warfare. But the statement remained, unretracted, unsoftened, hanging over the conflict like a new threshold. Because once threats like this enter the equation, every decision that follows becomes heavier, every delay becomes more dangerous, and every attempt at negotiation starts to feel less like diplomacy and more like a race against something irreversible. At first glance, the message seemed contradictory. On one hand, there was confidence, talk of progress, claims that negotiations were moving forward, that a resolution could come soon. Even hints that the United States was already engaging with what was described as a more reasonable leadership inside Iran. But layered over that optimism was something far more aggressive, a threat not just to defeat an enemy, but to dismantle the systems that keep that enemy functioning. And that raises a question. If peace is close, why escalate the language? Why introduce the possibility of targeting infrastructure that would affect millions of civilians? Because in conflicts like this, words are not just communication, they are strategy. One possibility is pressure, maximum pressure, not just economic sanctions or military presence, but psychological force, the kind that signals there are no safe options left. Accept the terms, or face consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. In that sense, the message wasn't just aimed at Iran's leadership, it was aimed at everyone around them, at officials weighing their next move, generals calculating risk, at civilians who would feel the cost of any escalation, a signal designed to compress time, to force a decision quickly. But there's another possibility, that this wasn't just pressure, that it was preparation. Because alongside the rhetoric, there were other clues. In interviews, the idea surfaced of taking the oil, not negotiating over it, not sanctioning it, taking it. And in Iran's case, that means one place above all others. Karg Island, a small piece of land in the Persian Gulf, but one of the most critical nodes in the global energy system. Nearly all of Iran's oil exports pass through it. Tankers line its terminals, pipelines feed into it, remove it from the equation, and Iran's ability to sell oil is crippled almost instantly. But there's a problem. You don't take a place like that from the air. You don't secure it with distant strikes or temporary pressure. You take it with people, with ships, with boots on the ground, and that changes everything. Because once troops are involved, the conflict shifts. It becomes harder to contain, harder to control, and far more difficult to end. Experts were already warning about this trajectory, that even a limited operation focused on islands or strategic points could trigger something much larger. A chain reaction, one that pulls in other regions, other groups, other fronts, and suddenly the earlier contradiction starts to make more sense. Talk of peace alongside preparations for escalation. Because in modern conflicts, those two things often move together. Negotiation backed by threat, diplomacy shadowed by force, but there's a limit to how long that balance can hold. At some point, the pressure either forces a deal or it breaks something, and when it breaks, it rarely stops where anyone expects. The response did not come with hesitation, it came with rejection. Iran dismissed the al-Accord proposals outright, calling them excessive, unrealistic, detached from reality. There would be no quick agreement, no quiet compromise behind closed doors, and more importantly, no sign of backing down. Because from Tehran's perspective, this wasn't just negotiation, it was pressure, pushed to the extreme, and pressure like that demands a response. Publicly, Iranian officials drew a clear line. There had been no direct talks, no agreements, no concessions. Everything, they insisted, was being filtered through intermediaries, countries trying to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. But behind that denial, the tone was shifting, hardening. Warnings began to surface, not just about resisting demands, but about what would happen if those demands turned into action. If energy infrastructure was targeted, then energy infrastructure across the region could become a battlefield. Oil facilities, economic hubs, anything, connected, directly or indirectly, to the United States. Nothing would be off limits, and that threat carried weight. Because Iran had already shown it was willing to expand the conflict beyond its borders, missile strikes had hit deeper into the region. Targets in Israel, critical infrastructure elsewhere, signals that retaliation would not be contained. At the same time, something else was happening. Inside the country, preparations were beginning, calls for volunteers, not soldiers in the traditional sense, but civilians ready to sacrifice themselves if necessary. A concept with deep roots in Iran's past, a reminder of earlier wars, where sheer numbers and determination were used to overwhelm more advanced forces. It wasn't just symbolism, it was a message. This would not be a short conflict, and it would not be easy. Military leaders reinforced that message even more directly. They warned that if American forces entered Iranian territory, they would be met immediately, not with negotiation, but with fire. And beyond the rhetoric, there were signs of real preparation, defensive systems repositioned, strategic locations reinforced, key assets, like Karg Island, being fortified, as if expecting something more than airstrikes. Because from Iran's point of view, the threat was no longer hypothetical. It was becoming operational. And when both sides begin preparing, not just speaking, the nature of the conflict changes again. It becomes less about what might happen, and more about what is already in motion. At that point, diplomacy doesn't disappear, but it starts to lose time. And in a conflict like this, time is the one thing neither side can afford to run out of. The reaction was immediate, and it wasn't unified. Across the world, governments began to distance themselves, carefully at first, then more openly. Spain made one of the clearest moves. It closed its airspace to U.S. military aircraft involved in the conflict. A quiet decision on the surface, but strategically, it sent a message. This war was no longer something allies could automatically support. In the United Kingdom, the tone was just as direct. This is not our war. A line drawn, publicly, a signal that even close partners were unwilling to be pulled deeper into a conflict that was becoming harder to predict. And then came one of the most telling appeals, from Egypt, a country that understands the region perhaps better than most. Its president spoke not in threats, but in urgency. A direct message to Washington: stop the war. Because once it spreads across the Gulf, no one will be able to contain it. That warning wasn't theoretical. It reflected something already happening beneath the surface. The conflict was beginning to stretch, not just geographically, but economically. Oil markets were reacting in real time. Prices surged toward historic highs, climbing at a pace not seen since some of the most destabilizing moments in modern energy history. And this wasn't just about fuel. Oil is the foundation of global industry. Transportation, manufacturing, food distribution. When it spikes, everything else follows. The International Monetary Fund issued a stark assessment. If the conflict continued, the result would be simple: higher prices, slower growth across the entire world. In other words, this was no longer a regional crisis. It was becoming a global one. Behind closed doors, countries that had no direct role in the fighting were now scrambling to prevent its expansion. Mediation efforts intensified. Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, each trying to broker some form of agreement, anything that could slow the momentum. But even those efforts carried uncertainty. There was no clear progress, no confirmed breakthrough, only fragments of proposals passed between sides that still refused to speak directly. And while diplomats worked, markets kept rising, warnings kept escalating, and governments kept preparing for scenarios they hoped would never happen. Because the deeper fear wasn't just war, it was chain reaction, a conflict that pulls in one country, then another, until the original cause almost doesn't matter anymore. And standing in the middle of it all was a simple, unresolved question. If no one wants a wider war, why does everything seem to be moving in that direction? Until this point, the war had remained at a distance. Missiles, airstrikes, signals of power projected across borders but never fully crossing into occupation. That distance mattered, because as long as it held, there was still space to step back. But now, that distance was shrinking. Reports began to surface that the Pentagon was preparing for something more sustained, not just strikes, not just pressure, operations, weeks of them. And within those discussions, one idea kept returning. Karg Island, the same strategic point that had already been mentioned in threats, the same location that handles the vast majority of Iran's oil exports. If it were seized, Iran's economic lifeline would be cut almost instantly. But seizing it would require something the conflict had not yet seen: American troops on the ground, and that changes the equation completely. Because air power can be withdrawn, missiles can be paused, but once troops are deployed, the conflict becomes physical in a different way, immediate, unavoidable, and far harder to contain. Iran understood that, and its response made that clear. Officials warned that any ground presence, any attempt to take territory would be met not just with resistance, but with escalation. Direct confrontation, the kind that doesn't stay limited for long. Experts began to speak more openly about what that could trigger. Not just a battle over one island, but a chain reaction across the region. In Yemen, armed groups already aligned against U.S. interests could open another front. In Iraq, militias could mobilize. In Lebanon, where tensions were already rising, the situation could ignite further. Multiple conflicts, merging into one, and once that happens, there is no central battlefield, no single front line, just a widening circle of instability. One analyst described it as approaching a point of no return, not because a single action would guarantee full-scale war, but because enough pressure points were building that something, somewhere, would eventually break. And when it does, every alliance is tested, every assumption is challenged, every attempt at control begins to slip. This is the moment where wars change character. From contained conflict to something far more unpredictable. Because once ground forces are involved, it's no longer about signaling strength. It's about holding ground, taking losses, and committing to a path that becomes harder and more costly to reverse with every step forward. And standing at that edge, the question is no longer whether escalation is possible, it's whether anyone can still stop it before the first step is taken. And then, the conflict began to spread, not in a single direction, but in all directions at once. Strikes were no longer confined to one battlefield. They appeared across the region, almost simultaneously. In Kuwait, a critical water and electrical facility was hit. In Israel, an oil refinery became a target. In Lebanon, fighting intensified as ground operations pushed further south. And from Yemen, missiles were launched again, opening yet another front in a war that was already stretching thin. This was no longer a contained conflict. It was becoming a network of conflicts, each one connected, each one feeding into the next. And in that environment, control becomes fragile. Because every new strike carries risk, not just of damage, but of miscalculation, of hitting the wrong target, of triggering a response that no one fully intended. Even neutral forces were no longer safe. United Nations peacekeepers, stationed in Lebanon to stabilize the region, were caught in the chaos. their vehicle destroyed by an explosion of unknown origin, lives lost without clarity on who was responsible. That uncertainty is dangerous, because when responsibility is unclear, accountability disappears. And when accountability disappears, escalation becomes easier. At the same time, new forms of attack began to appear. Drone strikes targeting military bases, operations carried out without clear attribution, conflicts layered on top of each other, state actors, non-state groups, proxies, all moving within the same space. And the battlefield itself was changing. It was no longer defined by borders or by the declarations of war. It was defined by reach, by capability, by how quickly one side could respond to the other. And in that kind of environment, there are fewer limits, fewer pauses, fewer opportunities to step back. Because every actor involved is watching, waiting, calculating, and preparing for what comes next. What began as a confrontation between a few nations was now pulling in an entire region, layer by layer, front by front, until the original lines, the ones that defined who was involved and where the war was being fought, began to disappear. And once those lines are gone, war stops being something you can contain. It becomes something you can only survive. In the end, this isn't just about one statement, or one leader, or even one war, because what we're watching unfold is something larger. A shift in how modern conflict is fought, where the targets are no longer just military, but systems, electricity, water, energy. The invisible foundations of everyday life, the things people rely on, without ever thinking about them, until they're gone. And once those systems become part of the battlefield, the consequences change, because the line between soldier and civilian begins to blur, between pressure and punishment, between strategy and survival. This is what makes this moment different, not just the scale of the threats, but what they're aimed at. Because when infrastructure becomes leverage, war stops being something that happens at the front. It moves into cities, into homes, into the lives of millions who have no control over the decisions being made. At the same time, the global response reveals something else: how fragile the system really is, how quickly markets react, how quickly alliances shift, how quickly uncertainty spreads. All it takes is one disruption, one closed shipping lane, one escalation too far, and the effects don't stay contained. They travel across borders, across economies, across the world. And that leaves us with a question that still hasn't been answered. Is this pressure meant to force peace, or is it something else entirely? The early stage of a wider war, one that no single country can control once it begins? Because history has shown this before. Conflicts rarely start at full scale. They build, step by step, decision by decision, until one moment, one line crossed, changes everything. And when that moment comes, it doesn't feel like a beginning. It feels like something that was inevitable all along.